See a few people joining, so we have a couple minutes to connect.
Good morning.
Good morning, Arlene. How are you?
Not too bad. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. It's been a while.
Yeah, this is what happens when we get busy, isn't it?
It is. It is. All right. Looks like we have folks on the chat on the audio channel, so let's go ahead and get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us wherever you're joining us from. My name is Sarah Dukevich. Today we're going to talk about some design patterns for testing. Don't panic if you're like, hey, where are these code samples? And I don't have the links for these other patterns. You will receive in an email probably tomorrow morning. Um, I usually try to send it the next day, but you'll have links to the code, the repository, as well as some additional blog posts that'll help support the things that I'm going to show today. So today's webinar, we're going to talk about design patterns for testing. I'm going to show 4 different patterns. We'll show 3 that are seen in integration tests and unit tests, and then we'll see one that we use for front-end testing. So I want to start out by pointing out what I call the testing design pattern pyramid. And the reason why I call it that is because of the way I have it organized. We have the factory pattern, which when we talk about it, there's essentially one method that you're going to use to create your thing, to create your item. The object mother, on the other hand, will have predefined items that you would use consistently in testing over and over and over again. So they're predefined. You just be like, okay, we'll talk about our theme, and I'll be like, give me one of these, or give me one of those of different types. But they're very predefined. Builder is at the bottom, and it takes up more space because it's more space in terms of code, but it gives you fine-grained tuning when it comes to the properties of an object. And you'll see, well, the objects I'm using today are really small comparatively, but I'll talk about what happens when I use them in the enterprise as well. Now, a little background, I've been doing this kind of testing since 2011, and so it has evolved over time. So you're going to see some of this. Yeah, Arlene's like, yes, testing. Uh, I do like testing. I do like talking about testing. And apparently that's been one of those mornings that's all I've been talking about. So this will be fun. But I need to set the stage. So when I do my demos, I want to make sure it's a demo that people can relate to. And I'm going to apologize to those of you who are at a lunchtime right now as you're watching this, because I do use food demos. And so we're going to talk about pizza. So, and the reason I do this, again, people can relate to this. Don't worry, there's no controversial pineapple on pizza, yes or no. I promise you, I am not here to start those fights. And if you're a vegetarian and offended by meat pizza, I apologize. And meatitarians, same deal. I play the whole stage here. So I have a pizza item, a very small pizza item. So it's got the name, the toppings, and the price. We could extract it further in things like the size and other details, but for simplicity's sake, to understand, because the code I'm going to show you today is just the patterns and how you could apply them to give you an idea of how this works. But I don't want to get too carried away with too much of like too many layers of abstraction and things like that. I'm going to try to keep it simple. So the first one I'm going to do is start at the top of the pyramid, the factory pattern. Now this factory pattern is actually 2 separate patterns, but they both fit under the factory pattern name. There's the factory method pattern, which is the one that I will show. And then there's the abstract factory pattern, which I will not show because it gets complex. So when you use the factory pattern, the code I'll show you, it has a create method. You pass in the parameters, it returns an object that meets the properties that you want and how you want it. So create's fairly straightforward. That's your factory method pattern, one method for creation. The abstract factory pattern, on the other hand, is, think of it as hierarchies of factories that create families of related objects. So you have interfaces that have interfaces references in there. So it gets really complex. The reason why I don't like demoing that is because the examples would be far-fetched and stretching too much for here. I'm working on another project where I want to show the abstract factory, so we'll get demo for that hopefully soon. But what I want to point out with the abstract factory is that it is used for more complex composed objects. So you may have an object that has all sorts of different properties on there, but those properties could be more objects that are composed of more objects that are composed of more objects. So when you have all those multiples, you might be like, well, I have a factory to create an order item and a factor to create an order. So the factory for the order needs to be able to talk to the factory to create the order item. So you start getting nesting layers of factories. That's where the abstract factory pattern happens. But again, it would be a stretch, so I'm not going to stretch into that today. Now I'm going to show you the code patterns and what they look like. And then when we hit the summary slide, I'm going to flip over to Visual Studio so you can see what it looks like in terms of organization. And then I'll show you, I have a repository that I use for this. And I also have some shell scripts so that it'll run it for us, because running front-end tests, we'll talk about front-end tests here. Running front-end tests can be a challenge. And so I have a workaround for that as well. All right. So this is the pizza factory. Now in my demo, I do spell out create pizza, but typically you can just get away with calling it create and leaving it at that. So you'll have this class pizza factory, and then it's a static create. You pass in your parameters, you get your object with those properties set. No secrets to the factory. That is pretty much how the factory is built. There's a create method, you pass in those. Now that means you can create any type of pizza, whatever you want to. Nothing's predefined, which is good. This pizza factory we do use elsewhere, so I will talk to you about how you can incorporate these design patterns, mixing them and matching them as you need to. I am using a library called Bogus. I have to get a shout out to my teammate Kyle for mentioning Bogus one day to me, and I was like, what is Bogus? And I was talking with another client, and they're like, is Bogus for real? I'm like, Bogus is not bogus. Bogus is for real, I promise you. So this using Bogus, what this allows us to do is it will generate for us the test strings and test numbers and stuff like that, where we don't have to keep coming up with random numbers and things like that. We leave it to Bogus to do it for us. It's built on top of Faker. So here's Faker. You'll see the Faker reference. Faker is coming from Bogus. And then we create a new instance of Faker when we initialize our test. Now what you're going to see here is, so like faker.commerce. So commerce is one of their data set collections. And so it'll create a random product name. Do we care for this test what this pizza is named? Not really. So if we don't really care about it, then let's let Bogus generate that for us. So that means less thinking of creative stuff like that. Now our toppings, keep in mind, it was a list of strings. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, hey, Bogus, I need some random words. 3's fine, but then I have to explicitly say to list, because the words array only gets to the array and doesn't naturally convert to a list. So I had to be explicit and say to list. And then for the price, we're using faker.finance, and it'll get the amount for us. So it'll generate an amount. I don't want to know how expensive this pizza is going to get or how cheap it's going to get. I don't really care either way. So Bogus can take that for me. So you're going to see Bogus. In the thank you email, I'll make sure to include, we have a bunch of blog posts that between Kyle and I, where we talk about these design patterns, as well as using Bogus and a couple other tools as well. Now in our test, so we've got the arrange, now we have the act. And so we're going to create the pizza. So this is where we use our factory. So hey, factory, I need a pizza with this name, toppings, and price. It gives us a pizza back. It gives us the instance of pizza. And then we can do our check. Don't tell me you didn't give me a pizza. Don't give me a null pizza. That would be bad. I like my pizza. Kind of hungry. No null pizzas. But then make sure that there's a name, a toppings, and a price, and make sure they got set properly. So these tests are fairly simple, but it's to show you how to use the patterns. So the factory, just one create, pass in the properties, it gets you the thing back. Okay, so far? I love seeing cameras and thumbs ups and nods. This is great. All right, so that's the factory pattern. Now let's talk about object mother pattern. When I first heard about this, I was like, Well, I already do this. The pattern has a name. Yeah, the pattern actually has a name. So think about when you're writing your tests and you have those tests where you really want to use that same thing over and over in different test cases. Like I always want to test to make sure that I have a product, and that product I want to make sure that it's got a good price and maybe that I could add it to my cart. So these are going to be separate tests, but I want to use that same product over and over. The object mother allows us to do that. No, with the object mother, I'm not going to use bogus because in this case, I have defined properties that I want to use. So very specific, I want to test for a pepperoni pizza, I want to test for a vegetarian pizza. So I'm going to be very specific with what I want to test for. With object mothers, you typically have specific values that you're looking for. Now, that said, it allows you to create multiple, you have different instances that you can create through multiple create methods. So I will have a create pepperoni pizza, a create vegetarian pizza. I could do a create dessert pizza if I really wanted to. But this allows us to have predefined items that we can then use throughout our tests. I see this mostly in integration tests. You may see it carried through functional as well. This is my pizza object mother. Again, the thing to look for with object mother. Now, you may not necessarily see the object mother name called out. This is a pattern that I have used in testing for years and didn't realize it had a name until. Because I usually called, like, give me a specific whatever it is, usually products or orders or invoice items or line items, things like that. But I would have this kind of thing. Talking with another client earlier, they were like, yeah, so these are kind of like constants or predefined objects for our tests. Yes, that's exactly what this is. So that way you can reuse this each and every time. Like, I just need a pepperoni pizza. If you're going to need a pepperoni pizza through multiple tests, create an object mother with a create for it. Same thing for vegetarian pizza. If I want a dessert pizza, I could put that in here. So whatever your item is, if you have different permutations, this is your object mother would have those very predefined permutations. So that makes it easier for those. Now in my demo code here, what you're going to see is that I'm using my object mother for my expecteds, and then I'm using my factory to get my actual. So my actual is I want a pepperoni pizza, and this is what I need on it, and this is the price. So then I can check to see, does this meet my definition of my pepperoni pizza that I have in my object mother? This is specifically to show that the object mother is already predefined. You don't need to worry about setting those. You're just saying, give me this. And then you can then check to make sure that the properties are matching expecteds versus actuals. Now, what you're seeing for my unit tests and my integration tests and my functional tests, when I demonstrate those, I don't think I have those today. I think it's just unit tests and front end tests. My unit tests, I use XUnit because that's what my teammates use often. But I have also done this with NUnit before. MS test is an option as well. When we get to the front end with Playwright, there's only going to be MS test and NUnit. And I'll point out the XUnit, gotcha. So with the pizza object mother, just know that we have this object mother that can get us multiple create methods to get us predefined objects. So that's object mother. What do we got going on in the chat? Good evening over there, Tim. All right, so now let's talk about the builder pattern. So the builder pattern is probably one of my favorites to use in testing, but it's also one of the worst to do for building it up, because if you have complex objects with a lot of properties, it just takes a while to build them. Because the way we build them is we have private variables for our property values, and then we have methods that we call with methods, and then we have a build method to return the object with our customization. Now, what I don't have in the demos, but I will show you when we could probably live code it, is how I deal with default values. So we have here, when we can, so think of it as you have an object with a lot of properties and you want to have control over, well, I want to create an object with all these default properties, but then change this particular property to something else. So this is what a builder looks like. All right, with our builder. So we have the privates. These are for all the properties that we have. Now, I usually start with default values, as in like create me an object with all these default values, just in case I want to just customize only certain fields. I could have the with name, with toppings, with price. Notice it's with and then the property name, and then whatever value I'm passing in. And then we're going to set the private variables to what we're passing in. And then we're going to return this. Now, this is the instance of the pizza builder in this context. So when you're like, what is return this? This is your pizza builder, because what you're going to put in the code is you're going to say new pizza builder. There's no constructor on the pizza builder itself. So it's just a default constructor. But then you're going to chain these with statements for each of the customizations that you want to do for each of your properties. So maybe you have like with defaults and then you're like, but I want to change my price to something else. We'll actually have some time looking at where we're at time-wise that I can demo what that looks like. So we'll do that. But then we'll talk through, so you have the with, and then the last thing you have is this build. The build returns an instance of whatever you're trying to build. And then you return that instance with all the different customizations. Now, how does it know what values to get if you have default and then your customizations? It's a chain, it's a pipeline. And so you want it in the order that matters. I'll show you what that looks like here on the next slide. So this is the pizza builder test. So with the pizza builder test, what we have here is that I have an actual pizza that I'll get from the factory. And then I have a pizza builder. In my pizza builder, what I have is I start out when I call my builder, so it's new, and then the builder name. And then it's the chain of with properties. Now you don't have to have all of the widths. You only will want the widths that you need. So I'll do a with default values and then maybe one customization. And we can take a look at what that'll look like. So it's the builder to call the default constructor, then the chain of widths, and then finally at the end you have the build. That build is what gives you the instance of the object with all of your customizations. So again, this gets you really fine-grained control in terms of I want certain properties. Works really well with complex objects. With objects I'm taking like 20s, 30s, 40s of properties. And those are just probably small for some, but for me, that's what I tend to run into. So the worst part about it is making with. So making each of these with methods for each one of those properties, that can get kind of boring, tedious, but that is what it is. All right, so those are the testing pyramid patterns. I have another pattern I'm going to show, but I think I want to jump to code first. So let me, we'll stop sharing and switch over to Visual Studio. All right, Visual Studio, let me get it in a spot that makes it easy to present. Maybe. There we go. Okay, now I can share the screen. And share. So you should see my Visual Studio, correct? I'll close all these tabs. We don't want any of them open. Okay. So this is Nimble Pizza, and in the thank you email, I'll include a link to this repository. Our Nimble Pizza, so I have unit tests, I have front-end tests, I have the front end for MS tests, I have a core, and then I have Blazor. We'll start at the core. Now, with our core, so there's my pizza object, again, all the code samples that you're seeing in the slides are all here in this particular code. That was done intentionally. Pizza, fairly straightforward. List of string toppings. I put our factor in the core because this can be shared by both the actual code and the testing code. Just give me a pizza. What I see commonly with pizza or with factories is that it'll just be create. So it'll be create with the type. I'm going to put create pizza back so we don't break our code. And then here's the object mother. Again, there's create pepperoni pizza. There's our create vegetarian pizza. We'll ignore the Blazor stuff for now because that's front end stuff. And it's not anything fun and fancy, unfortunately. But I do want to show unit tests. So I have a unit test project with my builders. I typically put them in a builders folder to start. And then depending on the project and how complex it is, I may have folders within the builders. So I may have something like an orders builder, a products builder, a categories builder, invoices builder, something like that. So I could have folders for each of those and then all their builders. Because what happens is sometimes you'll have more complex objects that have builders for their composition as well. So like a order builder, I might put orders in the folder, but then have an order item builder, an order builder. So those would be separate builder files within the orders folder. Same thing for invoices. They'd have their invoices folder with invoice builder and an invoice line item builder. This demo being fairly tame, I have a pizza builder. Now, I mentioned the width for each one of the properties. The one that I normally put in that I didn't put in the slides is, so I'm going to create a public pizza builder. This one is with test values, or not test values, but with default values. You could do, so if you prefer test values, that's fine. With default values, it's fine. And then give it what you want. And so I could say something like my price is going to equal 10.99. And then return this. So, now I have all my pizzas by default will be 10.99. But then I can override it with my with price. Or maybe it's this and toppings is equal to new list. That. And I have cheese and sauce. So something fairly straightforward like that. So then what I could do in my builder tests, so in my builder tests are my only ones where I'm using the builder. And that's intentional because that's how I wanted to build the presentation. But then what I would do here is I could say, you know what, I don't want the with 12.99. But I could say then to start it, I want my pizza builder with my default pizza thing. So with default values. And then from there, okay, what customizations do I want? So then I can do this. Now my test should fail because I'm not overriding it, but I want to show you what this looks like with the with default values. I'm going to go ahead and save it. And we'll set a breakpoint in here. And I'm going to go to my test. And I'm going to debug all tests. I only have one test that should have breakpoints. Bring up my test explorer, maybe. There we go. So we're on our breakpoint. So we have our expected pizza right now is null, but this should build us a pizza instance with the default value. So my pizza should have cheese and sauce by default, as well as a price of $10.99. But I'm going to override the toppings, so it's not going to show cheese and sauce. So if I take a step here, and if I go to my view, no, debug's got it, Windows and locals, I'll bring that on the screen. Does that show you my locals window? Okay, that's why I'm sharing the screen. The full screen is so I can drag windows outside of the IDE. We have this expected pizza. Notice there's the pepperoni pizza we put in. There's that 10.99 that we put with the test value with the default values. I didn't override that. And then the toppings, notice there's pepperoni, mushrooms, and extra cheese. So I did override that. And so this test will fail because I didn't update the price. So it'll run, I'm gonna move locals down into here. And if I go into my test explorer, maybe, there we go. So if I go into my test explorer, we should see the failed test. And we look at it and it'll be like, hey, you messed up your prices. Values differ. It should be the actuals coming across as $12.99, but we expected $10.99. Like, hold up, that's not what we actually wanted. So then we have to come back here and then we would fix it. So this is where the with default values is how that would come into play. I could take the with toppings off and then you would see that the toppings come into play like that too. So your with default values is applied first, and then not that. Test debug. And so then our expected pizza, I'm gonna F10 to step past that. Expand it, expected pizza in my locals. Name, the price. Notice 2 toppings, my lowercase cheese and sauce. So that's all coming from with default values. So just so you could see with default values does actually pull those in, and then we override it with the widths. Stop there because we know that that's going to fail. So does it help to see the with default values approach? And then adding your properties after that? Yeah. All right. You guys back down. And we're going to do this again with the with toppings and with price of $12.99. So override the whole thing. Technically, then we don't need the default values, but we'll just leave that there to show how with default values is. Whenever you're doing builders, you'll have the width for the individual properties that you want to be able to control. Then you also want to have widths for collections of values that you're reusing over and over and over again. So one of the things that we use them for is when we think about like form validation. And so you want to make sure that your form validation is working properly. And so you could say, the thing that we use is called with valid values. And so we know the valid values should pass for particular validation scenes. And then with default values, there's no guarantee that that's going to pass validation, but with valid values, it will pass validation. So naming your width with specific names like that will also help you to understand which cases you use it for. But just so you're aware that like with default values, you can have other with collections. So that if you have collections of properties that you need to set over and over with a builder, those widths make it a lot easier. The factory tests, so you can see what that looks like. There's our Bogus. Love that name with the Faker JS. And so just so you can see what kind of things get passed in here, let's debug this test. All right. So we have our pizza name is called Refined Soft Shoes. Anybody hungry after that kind of name? It has 3 pizza toppings, I'm afraid. Mayati, 1080p, and Connect. This doesn't sound like a good pizza. And it's $955.13. But again, in this kind of case, we don't necessarily care about those inputs. They could be anything, but we want to test with values of some sort. So we want to make sure in this case that our properties are getting set properly. Now, these being simple properties and not complex objects doesn't show it as much. But if you have complex objects, you don't want to have to keep coming up with fake names and fake data. That's where Bogus really shines. And so this will pass because I've done this test enough times to know it. So yeah, Bogus makes life so much easier in the tests. And my object mother, which you can see there. Again, we use the factory to create the pizza because it makes sense. So you can mix and match your design patterns as you need them. Be careful, because don't have a factory with multiple creates. That's essentially an object mother at that point. You'll have the name factory, but that's not the right pattern. Object mothers themselves, again, I've used those for most of my career. I had no idea it had a name until whenever I published that blog post. So within the past year, I heard the name and I'm like, well, I mean, it makes sense, but yeah, having those predefined objects that you use over and over for testing without having to do the build or fine grain thing, it kind of helps too. All right. So we've looked at, those are the three. So the testing pyramid is what I use in my unit tests. Next, we're going to look at front-end tests and the page object pattern. Okay, so I'm going to stop the sharing and switch back to our slides. Any questions so far about the patterns I've shown?
I thought I saw a hand up.
Not seeing anything in chat. This is a small group, so feel free to come off mute and ask questions. Feel free to jump in. All right, so let's take a look. So the last pattern I want to show is going to be the page object. This one I don't put on the pyramid because the pyramid is used more with our unit tests and integration tests. Front-end testing is a whole different realm, a whole different thought process altogether. And when I talk with development teams about this, I have to remind them it is a different thought process. Don't get so wrapped up in it. It is, think of it like your integration tests and your functional tests and your end-to-end tests. That's kind of where the front-end tests live. The way you make your tests, these tests can be brittle. Different testing frameworks will have different guidance. Your experience will make you realize that maybe you don't want to do it this way because. So just take the guidance with a grain of salt. And if you're like, well, this doesn't really work for my setup, that's okay. There are other approaches out there as well. What else can I say about front-end testing? The front-end testing, so I work with some clients who are dealing with like Blazor or ASP Razor, but your front ends could be Angular, they could be React, they could be Vue, they could be whatever they are. The code that you're testing in the grand scheme of things is how does it boil down to plain old rendered HTML and the interactions with JavaScript and some CSS as well. So you have to get past the, oh, I want to test my mud Blazor object and how it works on the front end. Sure, you can test your mud Blazor object and how it works on the front end, but you have to remember you're not testing mud Blazor tags. You were testing HTML elements. You were testing the DOM. And then that leads all sorts of lessons of, well, what is the DOM and what are these elements and what is CSS and what are selectors and what are attributes? So it usually opens a whole can of worms. So just know that front-end testing is a whole different mindset because you have to get away from the technologies itself and go back to the primitives of HTML and JavaScript and how does it work? It doesn't need to be that complex. Now that said, I have not used this with WebAssembly and its creativity sometimes, but again, it boils down to JavaScript, so there's that. Now the page object pattern is used in front-end testing, and this is specifically used where you have one page and one page object. You'll see they go hand in hand as to why. Typically, I also have what I call the base page object, because when I'm testing front end, that URL may change. So I might have a localhost 7007 in development, but then I might have a nimblpros.staging slash pizza site, for example, might be my staging URL. And then if I'm testing it against production, it might be nimblepizza.com. I only want to change that in one spot rather than having to change all of my page objects. So that's why I have a page object base, is to capture that site base. You can capture navigation and other things as well. So if you find that you're doing certain things over and over and over on a page and want to extract it down to the base, go for it. But typically your page object pattern, you'll have a page object base to have the central activities, and then you'll have one page per object per page. Now, that said, when I show you the code, I'll show you how it's not really heavily organized because it's a small thing, but we'll talk about organization at scale. Because I used to use front-end testing in an insurance setup. And so insurance policies, and imagine what happens when you have to sign up for an insurance policy and all the steps along the way. Front-end testing for that. We were using Selenium and what in. Yeah, Arlene's like, oh no. Yeah, tools. So Selenium I still see every now and then, but Playwright is typically where we're using our tests nowadays. But yeah. And then you're gonna see element locators. So Playwright uses the term locator, but it's really just, if you think about it like CSS selectors, that will help. And I can't stress this enough that different frameworks have different guidances. So if you're using one front-end framework and you're like, I don't like this, but you're like, but I've used this other one and it uses this pattern and it works really well. Remember, patterns are not necessarily tied to products. So what might work for you in a Selenium environment may also work in a Playwright environment. Page object is one of those that has lived on for years because it works. All right, one moment. Let's go and look at some code. So I have a page object base, as I mentioned. And in this one, I'm just using a site base, but talking with someone earlier today, they mentioned, well, what if we put navigation in there? You could put navigation in there and pass it a URL. That's fine too. But I like to put the site base in a spot that I only have to change it in one spot when we change it for our environment. So what does a page object look like? Let's talk about that. So I have a home page and it's got a button that when I click the button, it's going to change text on the page. Fairly simple interaction. You can test complex interactions, but I wanted to get let's get started and get you interested so that then you look into it further. So we're using Microsoft Playwright. Microsoft Playwright supports NUnit and MS Test out of the box. XUnit, there's all sorts of parallelization issues, and so they don't recommend XUnit. I actually got the word right the first time. Sometimes it comes out as parallelization, and I'm like, we're not paralyzing our code, we're trying to parallelize it. So happens. But you'll see here, so I use NUnit when I do the demos. Most of my teammates prefer XUnit, and so if I have to choose between NUnit and MS Test, I'm choosing NUnit because they're fairly similar in their asserts. So I've got a home page that's going to inherit from my page object base. That way that base URL is going to be there. This iPage belongs to Playwright. So this is the page object that does the navigation and that holds the DOM and allows you to do the testing of things. I also usually have a page URL. Now, because this is the home page, this is just site-based slash. But like, let's say that we had a cart, for example, then this could be site-based slash cart or site-based slash catalog for a product catalog, something like that. So this is page URL is consistently, I put it at the top because I know that I need to go, okay, what page was this again? Where does it go to? And I don't want to be searching my code. So I'm very consistent at putting my page URL at the top, initialized when we create the object itself, so during the constructor. So that's why it's private read only. Then in your page object, you have usually the navigate to the page. So you could just call it navigate to. This is where we had a conversation earlier with another testing client, and then it's like, yeah, just move it to navigate to at the base and then pass it a URL. You're going to see a lot of asyncs and awaits. So make sure that if you're writing code like this and you have your await, don't forget the async. Every now and then I would write the await like, oh yeah, you just await. And it had task, but it didn't have the async keyword. And so it's like, why isn't this working right? Oh, we need the async keyword in there. So learn from my mistakes, especially my mistakes when it's super late and I'm not turning to caffeine at that point. It's like, but then, so you have a navigate, and then these gets are specifically get things on my page that I can test. So what do I want to test? Maybe I want to test my page title. Maybe I want to test my H1, which I have to stress, H1, one H1 per page. I've seen people who are like, yeah, but H1 in the styles, it makes it big. And no, one H1 per page. There are other H tags in CSS that can help you with that. So I can't stress that hard enough. Accessibility issues there too. So whole different ball. But so I have get page title. Notice here that title async is what they use for Playwright. So I don't have to tell it any CSS selector for the page title. Now for my H1, so I'm using what's called a locator. The term locator in Playwright terms. Playwright's guidance is to test with locators of what the user can see, or test using ARIA roles, and then steer clear of CSS selectors and IDs. Which is okay, but sometimes it is more brittle tests, and so sometimes you have to fall back on those CSS selectors depending on what you're trying to test. So don't panic if you're like, but I gotta use a CSS selector here. You will eventually, I promise you, if you get used to things like how the ARIA roles work and how these other things work, you will fall away from the CSS selectors, and it's okay. But if you need to lean on the crutch of CSS selectors to get started, that's fine too. You gotta start somewhere. Now, when it comes to getting like the header text, I chose a locator specifically so you could see that. This is going to get me that HTML element from the DOM. If it's not in the DOM, Playwright actually has some logic in there where it will wait and it'll do a couple retries, and then it'll hit a timeout, and then it'll be like, this wasn't attached to the DOM. So when we run our Playwright tests, I will show you, because I have a thread sleep in my tests, which I don't like doing. But then I'll show you the error messages that we ran into and why I did that. So we have get page title, get header text, get coming soon text. So I have a text spot that I have the ARIA role of status associated with it, because when I click an order now button, it's going to change from coming soon to not yet open, because we're still trying to open the pizza shop. By the way, there's no real Nimble Pizza. This is purely a demo. Don't think Nimble Pros is getting in the pizza arena. We're not. I promise you. I know. Sorry, Arlene. But yeah. And then my click order now button. This is why I had to do the thread sleep, is because this click async goes quickly, and sometimes it doesn't wait enough time. And so I was like, okay. So what do we got in our page object to recap? There's usually a navigate to the page. Then there's a get me the things that I want to test on my page. And then there's what are the things that I have to interact with on my page? So what do I need to type into? What do I need to click? Things like that. Those go in your page object. Notice it says other methods to interact with the elements on the home page. And it's going to be true for any page object. But the home page is what I'm working with here. So this is the page object test. Again, using Playwright and NUnit. So I created 2 little tests just so you could see. We want to make sure that our pizza page has Nimble Pizza for the title. And so the way Playwright works is they use expect. And so here's our homepage page object, passing in the Playwright page. Then we're going to tell it to navigate. Then we're going to say, hey, check to make sure that the page has the title of Nimble Pizza. But this expect is part of the Playwright's expect format. And then this other one here I have, so again, we have a now order now button that will change our coming soon text. So homepage updates coming soon text when order now clicked. Oh yeah, when it comes to test naming, it's okay to have long test names too, as long as they're meaningful. There used to be the whole laughing early days of C# when it's like, yeah, Java's names are so long. C# doesn't need to be like that. Hey all, C#, it's okay to have long names. Long names are meaningful. Long names make it easier for us to follow our code and our tests and understand what's going on. So that's okay to have. So in this one, I'm going to get my homepage object. I'm going to navigate to the homepage. I'm going to get my coming soon text to see what it's starting at, because what I want to do, I'm not going to grab the text and check for the text to say if it says coming soon. I just want to get the coming soon text. So this, how it does that is handled at the page object. Then I'm going to say click the order now button. Then there's my dreaded thread sleep. You technically don't need that. You can do timeouts, but again, you're still playing the numbers game of, okay, why isn't it waiting long enough? Why isn't it attaching? And then you have the update coming soon text. So after I push the button, I wait a minute to make sure that that text will change, get the updated one. And then this assert, this is end unit syntax. So asserting that the updated is not equal to the original coming soon text. All right, let's go look at the code. Turn off my laser pointer. And we'll flip back to Visual Studio. Share. Okay, so here's Visual Studio. We're still in here. Ignore the MS test. That was for another demo I showed earlier that doesn't have content in there. But I do have this Blazor site. And you know what? I'm going to start the Blazor site. I'm starting it with the HTTPS launch profile. This is specifically because of my tests. And I'm going to bring it over when it starts. Not on a breakpoint. All right. So just so you can see, no tricks up my sleeve. It's not a pretty site, just a demo site. So we have the Nimble Pizza title. You can see that in the tab up at the top. And when I click order now, coming soon says not open yet. It will not open. Maybe in 2030 for future Nimble Pros. But so this is what we're testing. Now, when I'm running this site, I'm going to move my site back here and I'm going to come back into my Visual Studio. I can't come up here and run my tests when I'm running my site this way. This doesn't really work well. So then what I have to do is I could tell it stop. I could tell it to run the Blazor using .NET run in the command. And then I could do the tests that way against the running site. So if I pull up my PowerShell and I do the .NET run -- project, Nimble Pizza Blazor, like that. And I need to tell it launch profile HTTPS. So I mean, I could tell it to run this way. So this is going to run in the background. And if I go here, now I can do the run all tests. So then if I go to my test explorer, and see what it's doing there. And so it says 7 passed, 0 failed, 0 skipped, ran in 6.3 seconds. So that worked well. Our front end tests. I'm going to expand my test explorer, my end unit, my tests. So remember how I had in my page base, my page object base, that site base in there? The reason why I start with the launch profile of HTTPS is because I have my site base set to that HTTPS URL. I'm going to show you because some people are just like, well, what do you mean by site base URL being that way? So again, we'll go to my front end tests, my page object base, this site base here, this URL, just so you know that it's not magic coming from somewhere. I go into my solution explorer and I'm going to do a search for launch profiles. So if I do the launch settings, this goes in with the website. And then I noticed to some people, they're like, oh, JSON and all the config, how do you read this? I look for the profiles. So these are your launch profiles. So the -- launch profile that I do. And then I'm going to collapse HTTP and show you this. So I'm running HTTPS. This is how I know what those URLs are going to be. I know some people are like, oh, Visual Studio, you press run, and how do you know which URL? It comes down to the launch settings and the profiles. So I'm going to close this so you can see which profiles I have. So I have HTTP, HTTPS, and IIS Express. These line up with this play button. If you click the arrow, you can see the different profiles. And then WSL is Windows subsystem for Linux, because I have that installed here. But that's why when you see me run the .NET run, I do that -- launch profile HTTPS, so I know explicitly what URL I'm going to be hitting. So there's that. Now you could do that, but then you have to remember to go back into your PowerShell, not that one, this one, and Control-C to stop running it. Who wants to do that? Who wants to have to remember, oh man, now I got to do that. So now I have to go to my command line. I have to go ahead and run just the website. Then I can debug my tests. And then, by the way, go stop this. Like, it's frustrating. So in this particular code repo, I have under the solution items, I have a shell script and I have a batch script. Batch script for Windows, shell script for everybody else. But just so you can see what's going on. So I'm going to show the shell script first because it has everything native built in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it run the project. So that .NET run -- project that you saw me run is because I have done this demo so many times to make sure that this script would work. And so here's the launch profile is already set to HTTPS. Shell script, the ampersand is going to put it into the background. It's going to be a background process. Now, when it creates that, so this is going to create a process that's running .NET, so I'll be able to search for .NET later. I have it set so it's going to run that in the background, then it's going to run my tests. .NET test, unless you tell it any other parameters, are going to run your unit tests, your integration tests, your functional tests, and your front-end tests. So I'm going to tell it to do its thing. Now, I have comments in my shell scripts to make it easier for those who may not be familiar with these scripts, but basically I want to get a look at the processes. I want to find the one that has .NET. I want to grab the process ID for it, and then I want to kill that process. I want to just stop the process. So that's what's going on in this last line. So I have a shell script that all I have to do, and I don't think this is going to run in PowerShell. Yeah, that usually doesn't run in PowerShell, but I could do that in my git bash. So we'll bring git bash over. Can I zoom my font on git bash? I can. Okay. So we'll bring git bash over, zoom the font so we can actually all read it. So cdd code nimble pros nimble piece of demo. And no tricks up my sleeve. I'm going to do a / just all .shell. Notice then it's going to do the run. It's going to run the tests. That's where the thread sleep is. And then one passed, one failed. Where did it fail? This not equal to coming soon. This is the timer isn't long enough and it doesn't always attach nicely to the DOM. This is where I go. The front end test can be flaky. It's a testing thing. It's frustrating. Why do our testing frameworks say they can wait, but then you still have to play the numbers game? We're still playing the numbers game decades later. But you can see I didn't have to do anything to stop it. So no tricks, PS, rep.net. There's nothing here running .NET. Now for the Windows folks, it's a different challenge. So we don't have that ampersand in the command line. So what I end up doing is I install a package called .NET Background. .NET Background then allows us to run these as background processes. So I'm going to then say .NET Background, run the project. Notice it's still the launch profile HTTPS. So I'm still very explicitly, the only difference is it goes from .NET to .NET Background. Now the website will be running in the background. Then I can run my tests, and then it'll kill the .NET Background processes that are running. So what this looks like here, I can do that here. This is test all.bat. And so it'll do its thing. What's nice when I'm in Visual Studio is I at least get the color coding of, okay, what worked, what didn't work. And this one here is probably also, yeah, not fun. So let's talk about that real quick. Yeah, I got a minute or two. So in my homepage tests, that thread sleep is there. I'm going to comment that out just so you can see when I do run that. I'm going to do the test all.bat. Share it shows, and this time it still shows coming soon. Sometimes it'll show that they don't match because there's not enough of a wait time. Sometimes it will show that the element's not attached to the DOM. If the element's not attached to the DOM, yeah, yeah, Arlene, that is exactly when I saw that. I'm like, we're this far along. We shouldn't be running into this, but alas, we still are. So getting started with Playwright. Also, for those of you who are getting started with Playwright in here, we want to be warned. So in order to do it, you have to have a getting started part before you even have it installed. Is you create your NUnit test package. They have installation instructions. Their installation instructions don't point out everything. They'll tell you to run into a folder and you run a PowerShell script. It's like Playwright ps1 space install. You cannot run that on some machines by default, depending on corporate policies. So be warned about that. If you happen to have the right permissions on your machine, you might be able to right-click your PowerShell when you go to run it and tell it run as administrator, and then do a set execution policy unrestricted, and then run it. The execution policy will be for that window, and then it should run the install process. If you don't have the ability to change your execution policy, then you'll need to contact your IT department to do that installation for you, or whatever your process is. You only have to do that the first time to install Playwright. After that, then if you want to add Playwright into your solution, you can do right-click, add, new project. Once Playwright is installed, you can do a search for Playwright, and then it'll come with this MS test Playwright test project and this NUnit Playwright test project. So it'll come with these already wired up with the dependencies for you. I'll create a new one just so you can see the boilerplate it ships with. So this is going to be a Nimble Pizza Playwright demo. Next, .NET 8. So the boilerplate for this, so it will navigate to their website. It will show you about the title. There's their page locator. In the email that you receive with the recording link, you will also have links to the Playwright documentation and how it handles the locators and things like that as well. I make sure to include all of that. So, all right. So we've seen the code. Some things to know in summary. So your factory method has one create method. Your object mother, you can have multiple configurations. So you can have, in our example, we had the vegetarian pizza and the pepperoni pizza. And then builder, the builder is awesome when you're dealing with fine-grained property setting, especially on complex objects. And last, but most certainly not least, is the page object, which is used in front-end testing and will make it a lot easier for you to encapsulate that logic and test. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Excellent. It's also so great to see you again.
I figured you better have something besides Scrooge McDuck to react to.
Scrooge McDuck, he comes off his camera or comes on his camera every now and then. I saw him. Yeah. Excellent. And then, like I said, I will be sending a thank you email probably coming more tomorrow. And then if you have any questions, reply to that email. All the replies to the thank you emails come directly to me.
Oh, and it's so good to see Tim's remark. I wasn't aware of Bogus. I've been using some other things, but this is going to be a bunch of time for me to spend on my tests and updating them.
Yeah. Yeah, Bogus makes life so much easier. And again, I have to give a shout out to my teammate Kyle because he was the one who introduced us to it. And I love talking about it now because it makes life so much easier. I don't have to go, okay, what fake data do I need to create today?
Yeah. And since I do a lot of names and birthdays and addresses,
They have
that
all
that
sorts
that's
of, yeah,
that's going to be a lot more fun.
yeah.
Thank you for making my job easier as usual.
You're welcome. Always happy to help. And if there's anything else we can help with, feel free to reach out.
Oh, yes. Take care.
Take care. Have a great day.